Welcome back to another episode of the Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Coach Danielle.
Hi.
And we're going to talk about what not to do during peak week. Now, I am going to interview Cliff Wilson for a episode on peak week. We have yet to set that up, but last time we talked, we had planned on that, and he's just really, really great. So we're going to get into all of the kind of things and the nitty gritty of peak week, but there's a lot of what not to do also, which I think is almost as important, if not more important. I feel like more things go wrong with this type of stuff. So first, let's just touch on what is peak week. And when we're talking about peak week, we are talking about this in terms of a physique athlete peaking for a show day. You know, obviously there are certain other athletes, if we work with strength athletes who are making weight, totally different. Nobody cares what they look like. They just need to make weight. Actually, when you make weight, you generally look horrible because you're super dehydrated and just sad and very flat. But when we're talking about a bodybuilding client who's getting on stage, you know, figure, bikini, etc., what do we need to do for peak week? So the whole idea of competing is we're getting super, super lean, of course, but then we need to fill out for the show day. And typically anybody who's competed knows that the weeks leading up to it, you look pretty flat. You know, you look pretty just like nothing's really popping.
Ed.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like dead inside and outside is generally the vibe that we're getting. And in order to be lean enough, that really is, you have to get through this period. And I think a lot of people see like, you know, oh, how I look after like a refeed or how people look on stage. And it's like they've literally peaked for one, you know, day, and really in reality a few hours, right? Like we're trying to nail down a peak for when they go on stage for prejudging and when they go on stage for finals, because most clients will typically do that twice.
Yeah. Another thing too that a lot of people like think of with peak week is like more food. And they're like, oh, outsiders are like, this is what they dieted on the whole time. Why can't I do this? But because that's what coaches highlight. But what they don't see is the 70, the 50 grams of carbs leading up to peak week where you're depleting these people. And then peak week, we're filling them out and they're eating way more food. And that's what everyone's going to highlight. I peaked this client for 300 grams of carbs. And people are like, wow, I want to look like that at 300 grams of carbs. And it's like, no, that's not what they did.
Oh
So
my
yeah,
gosh.
it's a very like unicorn week.
It's so frustrating. Like that's such a great point that, you know, a lot of coaches will point that out. And I'm not against sharing that, you know what I mean? But then again, it's without the context of what else happened beforehand. You know, like, yeah, it's really cool that somebody can eat 300 grams of carbs 2 or 3 days in a row, maybe, and get on stage and drop their cardio. But that is not what they were doing for 6 months beforehand to get to the spot. You know what I mean? And it's there's so many issues with that. But so the point of peaking is to look your best on stage. You want to look full, you want to be tight, you don't want to be spilling over, and you want to have, you know, reduced inflammation, because especially at the end of a prep, a lot of people are doing, you know, quite a bit of cardio, they're training pretty hard. So we just want everything to look really crisp, really tight, really full. So before that, we need to track a few different variables. So do you want to touch on that, like what we send out to clients before we even write their peak week?
Yeah, so I would say a couple weeks before peak week, I'll send out like a peak week sheet, I guess, or
Yeah.
like a tracking sheet, a questionnaire, where I'm asking them what their typical meals look like, especially breakfast, because I'm going to try to keep that meal like the same. I typically just tell clients to repeat their breakfast meal because their body's used to it. But definitely fluid intake, sodium is what we're really looking at the most. So how many ounces of fluid are you getting in and how many milligrams of sodium? So it's not just a rough estimate. I really want it to be super accurate. So getting one of those micro scales that people use for like other purposes um, is very helpful for times like this. Other
Other purposes.
so getting one of those, and then what I would recommend too is cooking like without seasoning and then adding seasoning. So you are again just more accurate, especially during that actual peak week. But so we have a better idea of like how much your body's used to. And a lot of times too, it's gonna fluctuate for person to person. So don't be like alarmed if you're like, wow, I tracked my sodium and I'm at like 5,000 milligrams. Like that's a lot. It's okay. Like everyone's going to be different. If you're not experiencing any like cardiovascular, like blood pressure issues, don't get freaked out by this number and what society says that we need to be at. So
Mhm.
I get a lot of those questions like, wow, I was like a lot higher than I thought I should be. And it's like, okay, you're fine. And we could talk about how more sodium is actually beneficial, later on. But
Yeah,
that's what we
sodium is so critical. So especially for people who are trained athletes, because this is totally different than Gen Pop, and that's a whole different discussion about the salt stuff. And anyways, but yes, we will be tracking obviously macros, food, hydration, sodium, seeing where their cardio is, seeing where their training is. And it's just like you said, it's so important, especially with the salt. I know you guys, it's a pain in the ass to track it. Like I've hated it every single time that I've done it, but that's what I would do too. I would figure out, okay, what's in the sodium as like kind of baseline for the foods that I'm eating. And then I would measure out the amount of salt that I needed for that day. And then I would just add it to food either as I was cooking or as I was reheating it. And it's another step, but it's definitely something that if you nail that, it's going to be really, really useful. So those are some of the things that we're tracking beforehand. And so let's get into some of the like what not to do during peak week. So first and foremost, it is better to do nothing than to do too many things. And like you have to think of peak week on like a hierarchy. So best case scenario, we absolutely nail the peak. Worst case scenario, so many things are changing that you actually look worse, right? So, and then the middle scenario would be we don't really change anything and you kind of just go in how you're looking. So ideally, of course, we're trying to nail this peak week, but so many people either throw too many new things in or take too many things out, or they just make so many changes. That's really the overarching theme here, is that changing too many variables is not going to be useful, and your body is probably going to be thrown off just because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, for example, um, adding in new foods. This is not the week to do that. This is not a week to swap out your normal oats for cream of rice or have a sweet potato instead of a regular potato, brown rice even instead of white rice. Like this is, if you run out of something, I would rather you go out and purchase the exact same thing than try to replace it for something that you had in your cupboard that you haven't had for your whole entire prep. So definitely don't add new foods. Yeah, that's the major one. And then two, if you're like, let's say you're a client who's prepping themselves and you're like, I'm just really overwhelmed with peaking. Like you said, I would just recommend not doing anything. Walking into show day the exact same way that you've been. I mean, try to add maybe some more food, but don't try to like manipulate sodium and decrease water and like all of these things.
Yeah, like the more variables that we change, the more there is a chance that something could go wrong. The great point about the different foods, that is a huge thing that we see with clients. And I understand, right? It's like, oh, hey, I ran out of this. Can I just try that? No. And this is when we have to be really particular. Obviously our brand as a general whole is all about like improving flexibility with your mindset and adjusting. But hey,
Peak is not that week.
peak week is not the week to moderate your choices, right? Peak week is very dialed in. You've been eating sweet potatoes, we're going to keep eating sweet potatoes. And anybody who's prepped knows this. Like, I don't know the exact reason. I mean, there's obviously some theories that I have, but as we diet, we just get a lot more sensitive and we notice things more. Like right now, if I were to add a food that maybe my body didn't agree with, I may have a reaction, but I'm not really going to notice it that well. If I lost 20 pounds and then I had that same reaction, I would be able to see that a lot more. Everything is just much more dramatic when you're really lean, especially when it comes to like stomach distension or like just how you're digesting food and everything. So it's one of those things that we really want to make sure that we're not making a lot of changes just because, people do have more sensitive digestive tracts as they diet down. So whatever kind of safe foods that you've been eating that work really, really well for you, that is the week that we're going to keep all of that the same. And again, this is not the week to be like, oh, I really want to add in, I've been so hungry. Let me add in all these salads for volume. Like, hey, probably not a good idea either, right? Like, no, I don't want you to say don't eat any vegetables. Of course, if we still want to have some vegetables during peak week. But these like weird, like any of the weird foods, probably like let's not have a ton of them. And like just big volume of salads, like that kind of stuff. Like, yeah,
Broccoli,
yeah, just like
cauliflower,
slamming
sprouts.
cruciferous veggies, like probably not the best idea. So keep things really simple, keep things, that are working for you. But on the other side of that token, I don't want people to think that they drastically have to adjust everything either, right? Meaning like, okay, well, if I was eating this, well, what, just maybe have a little bit less of that. One thing we see a lot is people thinking that they need to change or like cut out all of their like supplements and stuff, right? I don't know if like I still feel like these questions come up a lot.
Artificial sweeteners like BCAAs,
Mhm.
BCAAs aren't as popular anymore, but that used to be a big one. Do I need to cut
Yes.
out BCAAs, pre-workouts, like all that type of stuff?
Yep. And it's one of those things. It's like, all right, if you know, can an excessive amount of artificial sweeteners bother someone's digestive system? Absolutely. Is every client going to be more sensitive some clients are just much more sensitive to that, but those are also the things that they're going to know during like the weeks leading up to it. So if they're like, man, every time that I have like this drink or something, I feel super bloated. Again, probably not the best to have that. Or hey, I started slamming 5 Diet Cokes because I was hungry. Let's maybe not do that on peak week, right? But we also don't need to.
7 more days. It's okay to be hungry.
It's
You will
okay.
you spent 20 weeks dieting and being hungry.
Like, it's gonna be okay. But yeah, but that isn't also to say though that you don't have to cut that out, right? If you want to have a, you know, diet drink or like, a scoop of pre-workout that you've been having, totally fine. Again, anything, the whole theme of this is we don't want to make a lot of changes and we don't really want a lot of things in excess. That really, I think, is like the main point here is like anything in excess can cause problems anyway, right? And I know things get a little weird at the end of prep. We all start doing kind of weird, funky stuff that we probably wouldn't do normally. Most people aren't like, yeah, I chewed a pack of gum every day. Like that's not normal for most clients. However, at the end of a prep, maybe it's like, I have more gum than I probably would normally have in a kind of non-dieting scenario. But anything in excess can create issues, especially gum, because gum is literally bringing air like into your stomach. So I find that a lot of people who excessively chew gum have just a lot of GI issues anyway. Again, separate topic, not just peak week related. But anybody who chews a lot of gum, like I generally see, it's pretty consistent that I see changes. So in terms of like artificial sweeteners and stuff, again, don't be having an ass load of them, but having some, if you've been having them and you're not having an issue, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, like one of the mini cans of like Coke Zero, because they have like the little mini cans now,
Oh, do
is
they?
okay. Having 47, whatever you said during the that's what I was laughing at earlier. When you're like 27 cans of like soda, having that every single day on peak week is definitely not okay. I would even say 3 is a lot, but yeah.
We need to go find that video. I can't remember what it was, but you guys, when we were filming the foundations course, there I tried to use, me being dramatic as usual, and I said something and about drinking a lot of soda, and like we literally like it was like 10 minutes. Like it was like one of those like don't even look at me, bro situations. Like we just kept looking at
You're
each
like
other,
crying.
cry. Yeah, of course I'm crying. I always cry, laugh. It's so horrible. um so I actually, oh my god, I feel like I've shared this story on the podcast because I just need to compete again, so I have more crazy stories. But I do remember like not taking my own advice here, added in some different thing on peak week.
Is it popcorn? Is it the
Yeah,
popcorn story?
yeah,
Okay.
we've definitely talked about that. But I added in
Well,
something very
I don't think
stupidly.
you say the whole story because there's new listeners, and I don't know if you said it on the podcast. You just told us like
Okay, maybe I don't know. Regardless, here's the story. If you've already heard it, sorry. So it was peak week. Actually, this was the show that I turned pro at, like the week
so it
out.
worked.
What?
I said it worked.
It did. Actually, it did because then we changed my peaking structure because of that. So I was like absolutely fucking toast, of course, at the end of this very, very long year of prepping, was in grad school, and I was like, I have some work to do, but like let me just go grab something from Whole Foods. Like I need to make dinner and then I'll just get all my other groceries tomorrow. So I used to live right next to Whole Foods. So I went there, I got what I needed to. I was like, oh, I have some extra carbs, whatever. Like, let me just look at this. Let me just see. I'm like perusing the aisles, like, falling asleep. And I was looking, I must have looked at a million different bags of different popcorn. And for most of the time, I always eat like the 100-calorie things, you know, whatever. So, but popcorn can be like hella calorie dense in terms of how much fat that they have. And so I pick up this bag and I must have mixed up in my head. I said, okay, I got the small bag, thought it was these macros. It was not. I go and I get home and I eat it. I crush it because I'd already in my mind done the math on this. And so I'm just eating while I'm working. The worst plans of all plans, right? Like just not really double checking, eating while you're working. And then all of a sudden, like about 30 minutes, an hour later, I'm like, I feel way too good right now. Like I have energy. Like this was not a low calorie popcorn. So I go in the trash can and I'm like, oh my God. Oh my God. And like I wasn't like a super low day that was that day, but it wasn't like a high day by any means. And I remember I was like, fuck, I'm so stupid. And I was like, what am I gonna do? And I literally like, you know, in prep brain, like everything like is just absolutely catastrophic. You know what I mean? Which, you know, now if I was coaching someone, I'd be like, hey, we'll just make an adjustment. But I was like, what am I gonna do? And so just so dramatic. And then Ryan was like, hey, why don't you just reach out to Lane and ask him what to do? That's why he's your coach. And I was like, okay, you're right. So then I was just so embarrassed, you know, it was more embarrassing than anything else. Like this stupid mistake, like after all these months of prepping. Anyways, and he was like, no worries, like today will be like your highest day instead of whatever day, and we'll just restructure, we'll get back on low days. So it actually restructured how I did my peaks moving forward, which was interesting and nice. So I always found that I did better having like a higher day, and then many low days, and then higher again. So anyways, it worked out fine. But like in that moment, it was absolutely like that's the one thing about prep that just really does distort things. Like you just can't handle stuff as well. Like now, like something like that, I'd be like, well, now I also have a lot more experience. So I'd be like, okay. But there was just so much kind of pressure riding on that show. Like I just missed my pro card by like one placing, and I was like really feeling like it was definitely like my best physique up to that point. So I was like, did I just ruin all this? But it worked out fine, guys. So, but take it if you do go to the grocery store brain dead on peak week, make sure that you are reading and double checking your labels and don't add anything new. That was our number one thing. If I hadn't have added that and I had just stuck to my normal bullshit, I would have been fine. But next thing, cutting water. So this I feel like, you know, is not as prevalent as it was before. But before it used to be like, oh, if you're doing a show, like you have to cut water. That was kind of like the running notion. And thankfully we've come a long way in the industry. Thankfully, because a lot of people have died, and like, you know, everybody thinks that's from steroids, but a lot of times what's happening is there's just so much dehydration happening too, because people are taking prescription strength diuretics along with cutting water on top of all the other, you know, things potentially. So there's a lot going on there. But there's been, I mean, I was literally at one of my like first shows, I'm backstage and a girl just passes out and she's being like escorted out. And I'm like, do you want any water? And she's like, no, I can't have water. And I'm like, dude, first of all, you're not getting on stage. Hey, I don't know if you noticed, but like you just passed out, you know. And then it was always hilarious. Like people would be carving up backstage without water, and they're like, oh, I haven't had water in like 3 days. And I'm like, so where do you think that food's gonna go? You know, you're just gonna sit in your stomach. So cutting water is not something that we recommend for like 99.9% of people within. And honestly, keeping water as consistent as possible is going to be the best recommendation here.
Yeah, I remember, oh God, how many years ago was this? Probably 10 now, probably more. My sister competed, and it would be like 2 gallons of water on Monday and like slowly tapering down, and then like literally sips of water like the day or and then that day up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we do. If I have a client who is getting ready to make weight for, you know, powerlifting meet or a jiu-jitsu competition or anything that they need to make weight, that's what we do. But you look horrible. So you're dehydrating yourself to make weight. And the reason that you want to, when you're trying to make weight, you want to dehydrate as much as you can, not from anything outside of just fluid, right? If we can manipulate fluid intake, that's really easy to manipulate post weigh-in. Not like, we're losing body fat, changing leverages, all those different things. Like that's going to completely change a performance athlete's end goal. So we can dehydrate as long as we have time. Now, if you have a 2-hour weigh-in, very different story than if you have a 24-hour weigh-in, even 18-hour weigh-in. You can get away with dehydrating, but that's literally a protocol. Like you increase water and then you bring it down. And having a few sips of water for 2 days before a show and then trying to add a bunch of carbs, like you're going to look super flat, and it's just not gonna look good. It's not gonna sit well. And again, these are the things, like if you're gonna make a big like those are not the big changes that we're trying to make here. Like you normally drink a gallon of water every day, we're going to stick to that. And for some clients, I actually even increase water as we're increasing or changing sodium, because a lot of people, they respond just like, you mentioned in the beginning, some people are actually a little bit higher than they might expect. A lot of people too will be lower than they expect. And when we add in salt and a little bit more water, they immediately, even without carbohydrates, look completely better. So that's a really great way that we do like to adjust peaking, especially if somebody is a little bit more sensitive to food, or maybe they aren't quite as lean. Like the leaner you are, the more that you can push food. The reason that you're seeing these people who are eating all these grams of carbs is because they got absolutely peeled. Obviously having more muscle mass is certainly going to affect this as well. But I've had even very small clients who are very, very lean. I can fill them out super hard. Somebody's not as lean, we don't really have as much room to play with there, but we can adjust sodium and water and not worry quite as much.
Yeah. I've noticed that too with like people who have like a wider or like quote unquote bigger midsection, having more food tends to like really make them bloated, but adding sodium doesn't really change anything. So yeah, that's definitely a great point that you made.
And then they're still able to get a great pump. And that's really what we're trying to do, especially when we are talking about bikini, we really want to keep that waist tight. But we want to make sure that we're not just like flat everywhere else as well. So another very, very small thing that most people don't even think about, but again, going with the whole theme of don't make a lot of changes, people will change their like skincare, or like the stuff that they use on their body, or like waxing. Hey, I don't ever wax, but I'm going to wax for the show. Whoa, hey, let's not do that. This is not a time to try anything new. We're not trying a new deodorant, not trying new skincare, we're not trying new lotions, not trying to wax. Here's the thing. You are going to be putting, for most people, multiple layers of tan on. And if you have just waxed and basically stripped a layer of skin off, now that's going to look totally different. You know what I mean? It's not going to go on as well. And you don't know, you could break out. There's just a lot of unknowns. Now, if you've been waxing for many months or years, okay, yeah, obviously you can go do that. That's not an issue. Your skin is adjusted to it. But changing anything that week in terms of like skincare stuff, it's going to be a hard no, especially the more tan that you're going to need to add. Like somebody like me, I got like 10 layers of tan on. I feel like I feel like I have a lot of tan that I have to use. Obviously if you're darker skin, you don't need as many tan coats. However, it's still not a great idea to make a lot of those changes just purely out of, you don't know how your body would react.
Yeah. That's a great point about the waxing, because I feel like me, just like having never competed, I would be like, yeah, I typically shave. I think waxing is going to be a little bit smoother, so let me go do that. And I would probably, if I didn't listen to this podcast or hear you right now, I would think that that's normal. But the more that you say it, that does make sense, because I'll get, upper lip waxed. And sometimes, because I was like newer to it, we'll get like little breakouts. So imagine if you're doing that elsewhere, it's probably going to happen elsewhere too. And everywhere else is bigger because it's a larger surface area. So imagine now you're just covered in these like rashy pimple things, and then you're putting tan on top of that.
Yeah, especially like, okay, underarms, even when you're doing the wave off, it's not that big of a deal. But like if we're talking about like bikini, Brazilian, like, hey, everybody knows how small these bottoms are, right? Like, and I totally understand wanting to make sure that like everything is good to go, but that is not the time. So if you're thinking about competing and you're like, maybe I want to get into waxing, do that for a few months. But if not, shaving is fine. Or whatever method that you normally use.
Start waxing the beginning of prep.
Yeah, exactly. And even actually, like speaking of the upper lip, so like it's so crazy because again, when, because I am so fair, I have to add a lot of makeup to match obviously the skin tan. So I'll build because I can't, like, I would never spray my face. That's not what this show is about. But hey, just do not spray tan your face, everybody, if you're listening. Please don't do it. No matter how pale you are, there's enough makeup in the world, I promise. You just got to build that. But I would notice that if I got waxed too closely, that because I would be adding darker colors, it would actually show differently. So even with that, like, even I'm not even using tanner, I'm using makeup, but it just because of the difference of the color was so stark, you could see that, like, it would be either here or like it would be like at least here was okay, because you're like, all right, I got a little highlight going on, that's fine. But here it'd be like, oh, great, like, no matter what you do, it's just not going to cover as well. So yeah, no major changes to skincare, waxing, products you're using, just in general, right? Like, just again, the big theme here is don't make a lot of changes. Okay. It's going to be much harder to correct than if you were just to kind of walk in again as consistently as possible. And then lastly, like, what not to do. Don't stress super hard over this, right? I know we're talking about some details here, like, hey, make sure you're weighing out your sodium on this kind of a scale, and don't but ultimately, your coach will send you the plan. Look over that plan and really, figure out, okay, what are the things that I need to change, the things that I don't need to change, what do I need to really dial in this week, and then just execute on it. It's just another week. And if something happens, even if I could have overate 300 grams of carbs by accident, or whatever the hell it was that one day, and still managed to make it work, right? Like there are ways around this. And I promise not everything is riding on this. Like, your prep was much more important than the peak. The peak is just going to enhance what you did during your prep.
Yeah. Take it from Lauren, the 300 grams of carbs that you had the beginning of peak week. Luckily it was the beginning. Got you your pro carbs. So
if we're gonna take one thing from this podcast, it's y'all need to overeat some Whole Foods popcorn, and then you might get a pro card.
Or that your coach is able to help you fix anything that you accidentally did.
I think that's better.
Let's not eat 300 grams of carbs.
Yeah, let's not do that, please. That was a big no on my end. But luckily, again, at that point, I was, I had time, and I was pretty lean, so I was able to handle it.
You were open and honest with your coach. You didn't hide it and say, I'm just gonna not tell her or him.
Yeah, and that would have been worse, right? Because I would have then spun out of control and been like, well, I got to go do 1,000,000 hours of cardio, and I got to do this. No, I certainly did a little bit more cardio that weekend, and I dropped food, right? I didn't continue to eat that way, but we were able to make those adjustments to the plan. So really anything, kind of some red flags as far as, like, if you are working with someone and you get back a peak week and you're like, I feel like there's a lot of just really weird stuff on there. Like you said with your sister, like, okay, I'm drinking 2 or 3 gallons in the beginning of the week and now I'm having sips for 2 days. Like, that should be a red flag. If there's really anything that's super, super drastic, make sure you discuss the what?
The diuretics with no water.
Oh my God. Like, if you can just not do one thing, everybody listening, please do not do that. Really, really detrimental. Not just for your physique. Obviously I want everybody to look good on stage. But repeatedly doing those types of things with very, very high strength diuretics over time really, really can cause some kidney issues and some health issues. This is aside from what you look like. I would argue that most people probably can look worse with diuretics outside of somebody who is very, very watery. All these protocols came from, like, very large male bodybuilders who at that time were on steroids that typically held a little bit more water, so we're talking about a totally different, like, you can't take that and then compare that to, a natural bikini athlete who's 125 pounds, like that's, but somehow that got murky for like 40 years and everybody thought that's what we needed to be doing. Thankfully, like I said, I think that that's not as much now. Clearly that's not the case, because I still will watch shows and girls are up there and they're shaking, not because they're nervous, but because you can tell they're like so absolutely dehydrated. And people still do, especially in the higher divisions, like women's physique and all that. Like, and again, I get it. But you have to make that decision. And if something seems very off on a peak week, ask your coach about it. And only do things that you feel comfortable doing, because I never want, you hear too many horror stories, about, oh, so and so told me to do this. Take that into your own consideration and realize that these things do have detrimental effects in the long run, that don't just have to do with that show day. So that got a little dark, little serious, but it is something that is very prevalent still in our industry. Or people will think that a peak week is going to fix their prep. No, peak
If you're
week,
not ready,
yeah,
peak week's not gonna change anything.
yeah, like peak week is certainly not the magic pill. It is like the final touch, it's like the little topping on the cake. It's the icing, it's whatever, you guys know I'm so bad. I literally mess up
It's
every
like those
analogy.
memes, where it's like Homer Simpson and it's like, it's okay, I got peak week. Peak week's
Oh, and it's like his like skin is like clamped behind him. Yeah. Yeah, like no, there's so many good Homer Simpsons. Anyways, yes, your prep is much more important than your peak. So don't do anything crazy. Don't do anything crazy, okay, on peak week. Let's stop crazy stuff on peak week.
And
Everybody.
two, I mean, this is a different topic, but if you have a longer prep and you are ready beforehand, you could always see if your coach is okay with like doing a trial peak week. Like, hey,
Mhm,
do you mind if we take a few days where we just try more sodium or we
mhm.
try a little bit more food or something
Yes.
along, or like double refeeds or something like that, where you're able to test
Mhm.
when you are like quote unquote show level lean, because it's
Yes.
different when you're like me and you're like, oh, let's do double refeeds and see if I notice a difference. Like you're not going to notice a difference,
Yeah.
but
It's like, oh, I'm
that's
so full today. It's like, yeah, no shit. I'm full every day. I got plenty of glycogen hanging out. But yes, testing is super important. And then just taking notes, as somebody is getting leaner, that's what indicates to us what to do or what not to do on peak week. And there's still changes that we're going to make kind of on a daily basis, depending on how somebody's responding. But generally speaking, we typically know, okay, somebody looks good as we add food in. Somebody looks better if they have a refeed and then they have 2 days of lower food. And then, that's when they look the best. Hey, add in, 3 days of higher sodium. Let me know how your pictures look, what kind of pump you're getting in the gym. Those are the things that you're able to test as somebody's getting leaner. And then the absolute best case scenario is to be lean enough and then add food into the show. That is the number one way to absolutely nail your peak, is to be lean enough early enough, and then you can start to reverse into the show. And that makes your body so much happier, and that makes the peak much more manageable. And like it's less about, like, it's less of a guessing game. You can make a lot more precise changes with that. So that's like the upper echelon of like what everybody should want. However, it's not always the reality, especially just, given, there's only so many shows a year, and you got to be ready for certain ones. So in a perfect spot, you're ready early. But that takes away some of that trial and error, because you're already doing that during. So then any kind of change that you make during peak week is going to be so minor that it's not really going to create such a big effect.
yeah, that's all I wanted to add on.
Yeah. So, all right, this was good. We just had a few things come up recently with clients competing. So I was like, you know what, this is going to be a really good topic about like what not to do, because I feel like, again, there's so much discussion around what to do, which is super valid and very important. But I did want to highlight a lot of the things what not to do, because these are just as important, if not more important. So thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please share it. That is the best way to help support us. For more information about coaching, you can visit teamlocofit.com, and we will also link the information below for the app. We are getting very close to launch. I have a feeling it's going to be in the next few weeks. So super excited to share more about that with you guys as well. So thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next week.